This is A Million Other Choices, and I am your host, Kim. And this is the murder of Brayton Bullock. The Bullock family is an extremely close-knit extended family from Barrie, Ontario, a city that housed about 218,000 residents in 2018. It's about 90 kilometers outside of Toronto on the Kempenfelt Bay. Barrie boasts one of the lowest violent crime rates in Eastern Canada, although Cheryl and Colin from this story, who live there, might disagree with Stats Canada on that. The five Bullock siblings, who were the children of a funeral director, grew up and had families of their own, but stayed really close, which meant that all the cousins who were close in age were close as well. There was Colin, Cheryl, Terry, Sean, and Shelley. Sadly, Sean and Shelley have both passed away, but they remain as tight of a unit as they ever were. And as sometimes happens in close families, Sean's wife, Heather, wasn't really as interested in being so close with the extended family for whatever reason, and preferred to keep on their own, like to stay in their own little unit a little bit with their son Nick. So as a result, Nick Bullock grew up kind of on the outskirts of the family, was not a part of the family events very much at all. In fact, the Bullock family said that they saw very little of Nick until he was about 15 years old. Nick was a troubled kid from a pretty early age. He got into schoolyard scraps. He was a bit of a handful. Now, his parents separated when he was two, and Sean found himself struggling to get visitation with Nick through his mom, despite the fact that he was working full time to pay child support for three kids. But only one of his was, only Nick was his biologically. So by his teen years, Nick was angry. He was defiant. He was also starting to use drugs and sell drugs as well, and living a lifestyle that was outside of the Bullock family values as a whole. But they still loved him. They wanted the best for him. They were always happy to try and help him out however they could. But he was clearly spiraling at that point. He was skipping school a lot. He was doing drugs and basically what the family refers to as kind of just bumming around. Sean had very little control over Brayton, and by this time he struggled to spend any time with him in his formative years. Um, and then he had those years growing up kind of in an unstable family home. So at 15, Nick was given the opportunity to move with his uncle Terry, and in with his family because he wasn't getting along with his mother at that time or her new partner that she had. So it was hoped that this would give him some structure and some guidance, and then clearly he needed that. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, Colin and his wife, Tammy's son Brayton, and Cheryl's daughter, Kyla, who were both 14, were the exact opposites of Nick. I mean, they were well liked, well mannered, well behaved kids. Brayton was a nature photography buff. He was a really good student. He was popular. He was very attractive to the girls. Brayton and Kyla were about 6 months apart in age, so they were pretty much as close as like siblings almost. They were just best of friends. Colin and Tammy had split up when Brayton was about 8, but they, unlike Sean and Heather, remained really friendly with each other, and they both remarried. Colin to his current wife, Teresa, and then, of course, much like my family, everybody's really civil with each other. So Brayton became really close to his stepbrother, Matt, as well, who was the son of Colin's second wife, Teresa. They were also close in age, and they became really good buddies and like really like true brothers. The arrangement for Nick to stay with his uncle Terry, it only kind of worked out for about 3 months when it was discovered that he was still skipping school and had taken money from Terry's youngest son, Quentin. It was kind of a last straw for Terry, who expected better of him, so it was time for Nick to go. Now, during the time that Nick had been staying at his uncle Terry's, Brayton and Kyla had met Nick. And as teens do, they added each other on social media, and that was kind of the extent of a lot of their interactions with each other. Although Nick would have noticed, like, how close the Bullock family was with each other, like, all the uncles and aunts and the cousins, and then he was a little bit of an outsider to that, so resentment started to build with him. And when Terry asked Nick to leave his house, he had actually asked Colin to be there with him, and there was a heated argument that ensued at that point. So Colin, seeing Nick's rage kind of firsthand, he felt that it was really best if Brayton didn't associate with Nick anymore. But as things go with social media and kids, it was a little easier said than done for Brayton. And I imagine there was some kind of curiosity there as well. So there was some chatting initially that Colin didn't know about. Now, Kyla, on the other hand, she completely avoided Nick. There was tension from the two of those really early on. Now, after being removed from Terry's house, Nick left to go to Vancouver for a short time. He's go visit one of his other aunts there. And a few months later, Nick returned from Vancouver to stay with his mom again, because it hadn't worked out with the half brother that he was going to try and meet when he went to Vancouver. But it didn't work out that long with his mom either, because on March 8th, 2008 or 2006, sorry, he had stolen her credit card and gotten himself a hotel room with it. So Colin discovered this information and he was concerned about the escalation in his behavior because Nick, he's only 16 at the time and it just doesn't seem to be going down a very good path. And um, he knew at this point that Brayton and him had still been chatting a little bit. So he called Nick and asked him to stop contacting Brayton. And Nick became very angry and said that he couldn't do anything about it and threatened him. And he also ignored Colin's demands. So the following evening, which was March 9th, 2006, Kyla was at her it was a family friend's place. Her name's Karen. It was her townhouse, and she was babysitting her kids for her. And Brayton was going to be staying next door at his Uncle Terry's place, but he came by to visit and have dinner with Kyla at Karen's house. Now, a few doors down from that, Nick was staying with his mom at a family friend's place of hers. So while Brayton was with Kyla, she said that Nick and Brayton were messaging each other. Now, Nick told Brayton that he was staying at his friend's house, his friend Leonard's place, uh, which was close by, and he wanted to come by the park to see him. And so Brayton agreed to go and left. So about 15 minutes later, Brayton returns with Nick in tow to Karen's place. Now, Kyla was not really impressed to see Nick there, but Nick plucked himself down at the table, just like he owned the place, and offers them each a hit of ecstasy. Now, Kyla refused it. Brayton took it, but he put it into his back pocket. He just didn't want to create any conflict with Nick, so he just sort of wanted to pretend like, fine, I'll take it. At one point, Nick pulled out a knife to show it to Kyla and Brayton for whatever reason, and this freaks Kyla out. Um, I think as it would anyone, but mostly because of her history that she had with Nick, who she knew was angry with her for telling her mom Cheryl about some of the bad things that he was up to. So Kyla asked Brayton, like, can you get rid of this guy for me, please? Can you just get him out of here? So she's quite relieved when Brayton and Nick left to go. They were going to go to the corner store, which was near the Allendale Recreation Center. And very shortly after they left, Colin phoned and he wanted to check in, just sort of hear what was going on. And she tells him that Nick had been there and had left with Brayton. So Colin phoned Karen and said, can you go, please, and try and find Brayton, bring him back home? Like, he is not impressed that Nick has ignored his demands to stop talking to Brayton. So Karen immediately left wherever it was that she was and started driving around looking for him. And she stopped at the corner store, but she said that neither of them had been there. So this was around 8:30 or so at night. Nick suddenly comes back to Karen's house, and Kyla takes note that he's not wearing his coat anymore. Um, and that was notable because it was freezing cold out. And he's carrying a bottle of pop. So she knew that he had been to the store. And he said he came back for his hat. Um, that Brayton had, like that Brayton had borrowed his hat and he was coming back for it. And Karen came home just as this was sort of happening from driving around and saw Nick there, but without Brayton. So Nick said that they did go to the store and that they got drinks and that Brayton walked him back to the place that he was staying at, this Leonard's place, that he had just come back for his hat. So Karen, who's now quite concerned, goes back out to look for him again. Now Nick again plunks himself down casually and on the front steps of the house and is just taking sips of his pop. Doesn't have a care in the world. So Kyla, who couldn't leave because she's babysitting, and she didn't want to be left alone with Nick. She told Nick, "Can you go back, please, and start looking for Brayton?" And he did that. And this was a little bit before 9 o'clock. At 9:13, 911 was dispatched to Lackey's Bush, which is a wooded park. It's only about 2 blocks from Karen's townhouse, which is near Little Avenue and Bayview Drive. Nick had found Brayton. Lackey's Bush is like it's kind of like our Fish Creek Park that we have here in Calgary, only it's a little bit smaller. So there's handmade trails, or not handmade, but you know what I mean, like just stomped whatever trails, padded down trails, and it's kind of known as a place where teens will go to throw parties. So Brayton had been found laying at the bottom of like a hill in this wooded area with his feet immersed in this small creek that went through. So Brayton, who he was a vibrant and spunky, smart, lovable 14-year-old. I mean, the light of his parents' eyes was deceased. Now, the autopsy reports would find that he had been stabbed 13 times in the head, face, neck, and upper body in what can only be described as a frenzy of rage. The head wound that he had been so severe that the knife had actually penetrated his skull. So, fortunately, Brayton would have at least died quickly. So, Karen saw the commotion at Lackey's Bush and she asked an officer what had happened. She just said she's a family friend and she was told to get a hold of Colin and Tammy and have them go to the hospital. Um, like all she could tell them was that Brayton had been hurt somehow. So Cheryl had the terrible, awful job of emailing Shelley the news. No, she hadn't been able to call Shelley because her and her partner were actually on their way to Thailand for like a holiday at the time. So Shelley read the email. She was on a stopover in Singapore and she had to get on the next plane home. This, there weren't any flights that day, so she had to spend 2 days in Singapore at the airport and pay for these additional tickets to get home to her family. Um, and these solo trips home, I mean, they must just be awful. There's no one to talk to, and you're just alone with your thoughts for hours. It's awful. Constable Jason Neville was one of the first officers on the scene, and he was questioning sort of the group that had gathered around there. Nick was suddenly really involved in all this, right? He's actually being annoying. He's interrupting. He's talking over everybody. So Neville asks him like back off. Now, according to Neville, Nick shoved him. So he handcuffed him, and there was a little bit of a scuffle. Now, Nick's friends say that that didn't happen, but regardless, he was detained for obstruction to police and then put in the back of this police cruiser before going back and continuing. He went back to the group of people to take some more statements. Now, later, Nick was driven to the station to be questioned as a witness, right? So Nick's original version of the story was that he and Brayton had walked to the store and Nick bought them both a drink and also a pack of gum. And then he kidded around with him affectionately, put the baseball cap that he was wearing on Brayton, hugged him, and then they parted ways. And then he says that he went back to Leonard's parents' place where he had been staying with his mom and assumed that Brayton went back to where Kyla was, like to Karen's place. And when he returned to Karen's house to get his hat, that's when he realized that Brayton wasn't there. So he went to look for him. He stopped at Leonard's at the way to ask a few people there to sort of help out with the search. And that's when they found him in Lackey's Bush, which was pretty central. It was close to Terry and Karen's houses as well as this Leonard's house. So the police had their spidey senses up about this story. He said that he never went into Lackey's bush with Brayton, yet conveniently found him very shortly after going to look for him. Now, the Allendale Recreation Center is very near this Lackey's bush, so the police asked him if they would see him on any of the surveillance footage around there, which is kind of a little bit of a trick question for him. So suddenly Nick's story changes, right? And now he says, "Oh, we did go into Lackey's bush to smoke a little bit of pot. And while we were there, these two men approached them and pulled a knife on them." Now, Nick says he told Brayton, "Let's get out of here," like a 14-year-old that had never been in trouble in his day in his life. And he said, "Nah, I'm going to stay," which is not likely. So Nick says that he walked to the washroom, went into the washroom, and then walked back to Leonard's to get some help. Now, this story is ridiculous. So his cousin's being held at knife point. He walks to the bathroom to pee, like just slowly meandering walks to pee, and slowly makes his way to Leonard's place for help. So when Cheryl learned that Brayton had been murdered, like she immediately knew that it was Nick that had done it. Like his changing and his odd story made the police realize that Nick's actually no longer just a witness, but he's actually a person of interest here. So the police leave the interview room to try and get a hold of Nick's mom, Heather. Now, unfortunately, it took a couple of hours to hunt her down so that they could resume questioning him. The entire Bullock family, they were together at Colin and Teresa's house until they could get Brayton's body back from the medical examiner's office to have the funeral. And the funeral was actually the largest funeral service ever held in the Barrie area. There was over 1,000 people in attendance. And Nick was charged with first-degree murder for the murder of his cousin Brayton. And his trial started in January of 2009. Now, the evidence here told the story, the true story of what had happened to Brayton, and this elaborate plan and the effort that Nick had tried to go through to cover up this crime. On the evening of March 9th, 2006, Nick borrowed a computer to contact Brayton by messenger and arranged to meet him at the park. They did meet up briefly at the park, and then they went to Leonard's place, and he introduced them to everyone there. It was a quick visit, and likely just kind of for the purposes of making sure that Brayton was seen with Nick and that they were getting along with each other. So he knew that this would be important for later to try to establish that he did not have a motive. So he took Brayton back to Lackey's Bush and pulled him into a dark wooded area and proceeded to stab him 13 times before letting his lifeless body just slide down a hill where he partially landed with his feet in the creek at the bottom. Then he calmly walked to the recreation center, washed himself, tossed the knife in the garbage where the police later found it, then went to the store, paid for two pops and some gum with his debit card so that there would be a record of it, took off his winter jacket and discarded it, and arrived back at Leonard's place where he changed out of his wet and bloody clothes, piling them into his backpack. Now, the clothes were later found and determined to have Brayton's blood on them. And then he concocted this story about Brayton having his hat to have an excuse to go back to the townhouse. So, based on this evidence, a jury of his peers convicted Nick Bullock to first degree murder. Now, troubles with the media and their initial portrayal of Brayton started early that had to be sorted out, that Brayton and him were friends and that Brayton was also a kid that was troubled, and that was part obviously was not true. Now, as Nick was only 16 at the time, uh, there was this exhausting process that had to start. Like, should he be sentenced as an adult or as a youth? And that has a bunch of hearings with it, all, of course, which take family members away from their jobs. It's all paid for by us taxpayers. And a judge finally decided that he was going to be sentenced as an adult. But there were more hearings, and because the defense wanted to try and keep him in a youth facility so that he could finish high school. And the defense lawyer also appealed to the judge that an adult prison would be too hard on him, saying, I think some of the landscape of an adult prison would be rather challenging for him. Now, meanwhile, the prosecutor and attorney countered, isn't it all just part of the consequences of committing a crime? Touche. The process of sentencing took months, and then there was a constant adjournments, postponements. I mean, it was a complete nightmare that just had no end for the family. Nick showed really no emotion throughout any of the trial or the sentencing. He never addressed his own family with an acknowledgement or an apology of anything for his actions. Um, so Cheryl, Colin, Tammy, and Colin's wife Teresa, they all challenged their grief into action, seeing there was a lack of services out there for victims and the sort of disorganization of how all the services are to navigate for families. So they put a lot of work into to doing services for them, and so that's where a lot of these stories on podcasts kind of end, but it is never the end for the family. And how this case kind of unfolds from there is probably going to infuriate you, and I think it should. In June of 2018, so this is after 13 years of hearings, adjournments, and the whole nightmare that the appeals process is for families, Nick actually won his appeal for a new trial um, on the ground that the police had erred when they were questioning him. So originally, he was being questioned as a witness without advising him of his rights. And then Nick being left alone for 2 hours in the interview room without any formal charges being laid while they were waiting to try and get a hold of his mom had been sort of a mistake on the police end. Although looking back, the police at the time, they were forced to kinda think on their feet, right? Then they realized he's a suspect, he's not a witness. I think that was also complicated by the fact that he's a minor at the time. So in the family, I think the family puts most of the blame on the court system as a whole and the judges that they feel they were let down by. So based on the evidence that was at that first trial, so even without his interview, I think that a conviction in a second trial would have at least ended in second degree, probably first degree again, but at least second degree. Um, but life doesn't always work out the way you think it would. On February 13th, 2009, after serving 13 years in prison, what he basically did is he pled down to manslaughter, and because he had served 13 years at that point, he walked out of the courtroom with his family, like, all of them together. There was no stipulations, no parole, nothing like that. Like, if he'd have gotten a conviction for the second-degree murder, which he initially did, um, there's an automatic life sentence. So even if you get your parole, there's still a life sentence hanging over you, so you're never off of parole. You're always kind of on parole for the rest of your life. But with manslaughter, it doesn't work that way. So there was no parole, nothing like that. Um, no conditions put on him. And like he just walked out of the courtroom with the family, like was just, I mean, they were just shocked. And I mean, they must have felt like they were just punched in the stomach at that moment. Um, and like, you might think that, well, 13 years is a pretty good sentence. Like, you know, he probably would have been paroled anyways. Like it is a good sentence for manslaughter, but I don't think for a planned and deliberate attack of pure rage that on your own cousin that you try to cover up and cover your tracks. On October 26, 2019, Nick Bullock actually posted a picture. It was depicting a skeleton drinking coffee with the words, "Don't throw my past in my face. I know what the fuck I did." And then in December of 2021, he started a GoFundMe page for himself to collect cash to start a business delivering items to homebound seniors. He's such a martyr. At the time of this recording, or at least at the time of the recording of the podcast, he has collected $125 from two different donors. That was the infuriating and sad murder of Brayton Bullock. And on the podcast, which was released earlier this year, I actually spoke with Colin and Cheryl Bullock about the case. So there's some discussions with them on the podcast episode if you wanted to go and listen to that. So once again, I'd like to thank the entire Bullock family for their support in telling Brayton's story and helping me with some of the details and just sort of sharing their feelings and their experiences, which they did on the podcast. Um, and I'm sure that this story infuriated many of you. So I will try to leave some resources in the try to remember because I always forget. Show notes on maybe on my Instagram page as well if you'd like to try and help and get involved in some way with victim services. So please join me again for another episode. And as always, thank you so much for watching.